Council, that we have lots of people coming. They're more likely to give us money so we can buy the books, so we can contract out and get noted speakers to come in and give you more content material. And also have master teachers showing you great lessons they had that you can take home with you and use next week. So thank you for coming.
Yeah. So in the manner of public service announcements, there's a couple of things that are true. One is I'm mic'd up, and this is the first time in my life I think I've ever been mic'd up, so this is like a crucial moment in my life, I guess. And speaking of being mic'd up, this is actually recorded, which I didn't know was happening, but that's awesome. Again, something else in my life. This is amazing. And so apparently, I'm going to ask you questions, but it won't get picked up unless you press this little microphone thing on in front of you and talk. So there'll be some moments when I ask questions, and so like for the sake of the recording, if you wouldn't mind remembering to pop this on and talk into the mic. That way, for posterity, when the millions of people, I think this one's going viral, when the millions of people watch this, your insights can be recorded for time, all of time. We are. Another public service announcement before I get started. In this corner, there is a tiny URL link, which will take you to something where after the presentation, you could download the PowerPoint, you could get a handout, and the handout includes like a rundown of the curriculum I'm going to talk about. It includes like, in the rundown of the curriculum, there's a bunch of different pop culture sources that you could potentially use. There's some kind of secondary sources about culture and history or the time period that is discussed in a given unit, and that's all laid out. And so I hope that would be helpful for you. And so, yes, if you want to write that down, and that way, afterwards, you could track down some of the information. Cool. All right. So, my name is Ben Leff. I'm a teacher at University Laboratory High School in Urbana, Illinois, about 3 hours away. And I teach U.S. history. I'm teaching the survey for the first time this year, as I just told people. Before I taught world history. But in addition, I teach an elective to juniors and seniors, which is basically the subject matter I'm going to talk about today, which uses popular culture as a historical text. So that class is on top of the standard U.S. history survey. And I think you'll kind of see why, given that it's on top of the survey, I can get away with going into some of the depth that I'm about to describe. And what I'll just say, and this is like a good standard announcement, like when, I don't expect, and I'm not trying to tell all of you to adopt my curriculum wholesale just because I'm explaining my curriculum. What I hope is by explaining it, I can sort of inspire you to think about, oh, I do this in my curriculum, and then I could incorporate that idea. So please don't think it's presumptuous for me to explain all of this stuff. Hopefully it just inspires good ideas from you. So if you walk into my class on a random day, you might see the kids watching Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a 1956 science fiction film, or listening to the rap of Public Enemy. That might be surprising for a history class. But believe it or not, I think there's some really good stuff. Like, this is about pod people from outer space coming and invading and like taking over the human race. But if you read it as an allegory about Cold War culture, as many scholars have, it gets at these fears of like conspiracy and mass conformity and subversion from within, like a lot of these themes that are quite prevalent at the time. If you look at Public Enemy and watch their videos and listen to their rap, right, it's, there are these pulse-pounding beats that are certainly, adrenaline pumping. But if you listen to it, there's a lot of political statements being made. And if you're studying like kind of black political activism, the iconography of black radicalism, it's a really rich text. Yeah.
You use the clean version?
Public Enemy is not that dirty, actually. In Fight the Power, there's one swear word, and I do use that dirty version in my class. But actually, it's not like NWA or something. Public Enemy is not as bad as you might think. The premise of my class is you can use popular culture texts like that to deeper understand the historical context in which they were produced. The way I think of it is that these help you sketch the ideological contours of American society at a given historical moment. And as such, what I am not doing in this class is using something like Saving Private Ryan. Nothing wrong with using Save It Private Ryan, but I'm not using like a modern work of watching a history movie that depicts a moment in order to study World War II. I'm using something from 1956 to study the world of 1956, right? The time period in which it was produced. Now, you might have, or let me put it this way. Some people could justifiably have some misgivings about such an approach. Certainly, you know, when this is done poorly, when the teacher just pops something in the DVD player to sedate the kids for 45 minutes, and when this is handled uncritically, it can be pedagogically lazy and intellectually feeble. However, when it's done well, I think you are asking your kids to do some really serious intellectual heavy lifting. When you are grappling with the question of what does a piece of popular culture reveal about the historical context in which it was produced, that is a really intellectually rich question for your students to grapple with. And as such, I want to kind of explain an approach that I do think is intellectually rich as opposed to intellectually feeble. And the way I'm going to do this today is there are basically three sections. I'll start with the theory. That is, how can we analyze popular culture as a historical text? Then we'll move on to practice. I'll kind of lay out my curriculum and some of the techniques I use in class to do this. And then we'll close with an illustration, watching a clip from All in the Family. And I think that can illuminate some of the things you can do with popular culture to study a time period in your class. As a way of starting this conversation, I want you to talk to people next to you, for those of you who are close enough to someone to do that. Just talk for a few minutes. What might a Hollywood movie from 1954 tell us about American society in 1954? And feel free to play like the if game. Like, if it was about this, then it might tell us about this. If it was about this, it might tell us about this. So just speculate with the person next to you. Go for it. Sure. This thing? Yeah, nice. All right, well, I will interrupt, and I'll ask you what you said, and again, I'll encourage you to press that button in front of you and talk into the microphone. Is anyone willing to share one of the things you talked about with one of your peers? Yeah, thank you.
The first thing that we both came to mind for us is gender roles in that time period.
Yeah, and I'm curious, why would, I agree with you completely. Why do you think gender roles would be a lucrative or a potential thing you could learn from it?
Just because it would probably be obvious, because in most movies there's probably men and women.
I mean, and that is a common trope in Hollywood films is romance, right? Yeah. And so we're seeing the ways.
Jobs or not.
Good, and who's performing what kind of work in the home, who's doing what kind of work at work in the traditional labor force. You could absolutely see that in a film. Other examples? Yeah.
We talked about communism and anti-communism.
Right. I'm curious, did you have anything in mind when you said that, or?
Did we have anything in mind?
Yeah, like a particular film, or?
No.
Yeah.
Invasion of Body Snatchers, I
yeah.
think came out in 54.
Yep. And so I think there's a lot of rich stuff, and there's stuff that works allegorically, and then there's stuff that's literally about communists, right? I use Twilight Zone episodes in class. Like, they are really rich for talking about communism. Yeah.
Morality. The woman of loose morals, something bad will happen to her, while the good girl will live to the end. You might think of Peyton Place.
That would be very nice. And so I think, a great example is we can see how different characters are portrayed, which ones kind of break certain moral or social codes and which ones follow them, and what is the prevailing ethos in a given time period about what happens to them. I think what's interesting is I bet you some of those things are being challenged in modern popular culture, in which the bad girls can get away with it a little more, and that kind of tells us something about society too, though I'm sure there's lots of good examples. Any other ones? So this is great in that what you are all getting at is, and I'm not surprised, you're all teachers, and you can get at, I think, the potentially really rich stuff, which you were all getting at sort of ideology, right? Communism, gender roles, again, this idea of proper gender behavior. And I think that's some of the richest stuff, because on the one hand, if you had said something along the lines of, it could show how people lived back then, I think there's merit to that, right? You know, the kids can see someone dialing a rotary phone, right? They wouldn't have seen that. Certainly one of the things my kids notice when I show old movies is, man, did they smoke a lot? And it's like, yeah. I mean, part of it is it looks cool in black and white, but like, also, yeah, people smoked a lot more, right? And so that stuff is there. And yet, some of these deeper things about ideas and values I think are most useful. One thing I think I want to make very clear is that we cannot assume that popular culture is a mirror of reality, right? That because a film in Hollywood in 1954 depicts American life like this, you know, the man working and the woman at home or whatever, that therefore all America was like that. We can think about that for a number of reasons. One reason is that it is entertainment, not reality. Like, obviously, Invasion of the Body Snatchers does not tell the true story of the famous 1956 pod invasion in Santa Mira, California, right? That is not what happened. And yet, right, you might be a little more tempted by this, right? This is I Love Lucy or Father Knows Best, because that's more naturalistic, right? It's not about pod people. I don't think the twist in I Love Lucy is in season 5, she turns out to be an alien, right? So, you know, this is much more naturalistic, right? This might seem like ordinary everyday life, but still, it's not really a mirror of reality. Reality doesn't work in like nice 30-minute segments in which a problem is introduced and then humorously resolved through the course of every episode. If we look at the world of Father Knows Best, right, this sort of idyllic depiction of family life, that doesn't mean that all 50s families were that harmonious in their nature. And so we still need to realize that popular culture is perhaps related to reality, responding to reality, but not quite the same thing as a mirror or an image of reality. Something else we need to understand about popular culture texts is that they are just like every primary source we grapple with our students. So when you give your students a primary source document, what are some of the questions that you always want them to be thinking about? Bias. I heard bias, yep. Who wrote it? Who is the author? Who's the audience for which this document is intended? We could keep going, right? What is the historical context they're responding to? With the question of who the author is, all right, what's their gender? What's their social class? What's their political perspective? All of those questions absolutely apply to popular culture. It is a subjective portrayal of reality. It has an author, or even more complicated, a messy set of authors with producers and directors and writers and actors. But nevertheless, there's an author. There could be an agenda, right? It's not a transparent depiction of reality, but instead a way of framing reality, a way of depicting it. It is absolutely intended for an audience, right? People aren't just making TV shows for kicks. They are trying to appeal to mass sentiments in some ways. And as such, when you treat popular culture as a primary source text in the rich way we always want to do with our students, you can get them to use them not as a mirror to reality, but like all of our sources, as this subjective take on reality that we can analyze in its context. And ask not, what was American society like based on this, but instead, what does it reveal that at this historical moment, this group of people try to tell this story to American society? And that's what we have to analyze. What I think we can get out of that is the things you all were bringing up, attitudes about communism, attitudes about gender roles, these shared ideas and values. Ideology is, in many ways, the essence of my class. That's what we're trying to pick out. And, you know, my case for this, and I probably don't have to sell a bunch of history teachers on this, but ideology is important because ideology shapes behavior. That is, the set of beliefs that you have or that a given part of a culture has are going to shape the way they interpret reality, are going to channel the way they behave in response to the world around them. And as such, if we study ideology, we can better understand the societies we want to study. For example, if you want to understand the Jim Crow South, you should absolutely discuss school segregation and, you know, disenfranchisement and lunch counter segregation and so forth. But I think it's also really important to study the ideology that buttressed the Jim Crow South, right? The systems that justified why you keep the races separate or why a certain group of people should not be allowed to vote. In order to really understand the forces shaping society, you need to understand that ideology. And therefore, I think popular culture is potentially really lucrative or has a lot of potential because we don't have this mythological document. It's not like in 1954, a bunch of Americans all got in the room and it was like, all right, we're going to hash this one out. What are our shared beliefs about gender behavior, right? We decree women should wear dresses and not pants. Yes, the hair should be shoulder length or lower. Ideally, they should not work. If they work, they should be in one of these enumerated fields. Signed, the American people. That document doesn't exist. However, popular culture is potentially quite useful in this regard, right? It is something that is produced for and consumed by a mass audience, and as such has at least the potential to express cultural understandings that were widespread at a given time, right? This is not just someone shouting in the woods, right? This is someone trying to make something that lots and lots of people will consume. And as such, it has this potential, right? And this is what makes movies or music or TV shows not just like fun things to use in class, but potentially really valuable for gauging that sort of amorphous, hard to pin down thing, which is shared beliefs and understandings. Now, I need a couple more asterisks. Could we assume that if a 1954 film sends message X, Americans in 1954 believe X? No. Think about your life. Do you believe everything you see on TV? I don't think the people in 1954 were so naive that they did either, right? Just because you watch something doesn't mean you agree with it. Just because you like something doesn't mean you agree with it. And so we need to be very careful about making facile conclusions. I saw this film, therefore people in the 50s believe this. However, perhaps there's something a little more subtle we could do. Let's take the example of, this is not pop culture, but let me just explain something. We have a widespread cultural understanding that nurses are more likely to be female. Doesn't mean we all agree with it. Doesn't mean we think that's the way it should be. But nevertheless, growing up in our society, if someone walked into the room who was the nurse and they were male, it might surprise us a little, right? That might go against our preconceived notions. There's a widely held cultural understanding that that tends to be a profession that skews female. Similarly, let's say there's an episode of I Love Lucy, and there is, where the women spend a day working in the workforce and the men spend a day working at home. And when they do, it all goes hilariously wrong. The men are totally inept and the home is destroyed. The women fail miserably at their job and get fired after one day. The premise of that joke is that there is a gender division of labor in the home, right? That joke only makes sense if there is a widely shared understanding that men are more often the workers and women are more often staying at home. And the humor derives from the fact that when operating outside of that sphere, it doesn't go well. That doesn't mean that everyone in 1954 agreed with this. It doesn't mean that everyone in 1954 fit neatly into those roles, that all women were housewives, but we are get at some kind of shared cultural understanding, right? Here's one other thing we can do that's a little more subtle. And for this, let me give you a couple of examples of views on bobbed hair in the 1920s. So bobbed hair, right, that short haircut. This is an opera singer named Mary Garden who cut her hair, and she's writing this essay on why she did it. And she says, you know, getting rid of our long hair is one of the many little shackles that women have cast aside in their passage to freedom. Long hair belongs to the age of general feminine helplessness. Bobbed hair belongs to the age of freedom, frankness, and progressiveness, right? To her, getting rid of long hair is getting rid of shackles, right? The long hair has tied them down, and instead, the short hair is part of this age of freedom and progressiveness, as opposed to a bygone age of feminine helplessness. That to her is what bob hair symbolizes, and presumably, some women agreed with her. Now, did all women agree with that? Probably not. And indeed, here's one who didn't. Mary Pickford, 20s movie star. She wrote, "There's nothing more feminine than a beautiful head of well-cared-for hair simply coiled. Can you imagine a fairy princess with short bobbed locks? It is unthinkable and almost shocking. How could the prince have climbed to Rapunzel? Let down your hair. I am by nature conservative and even a bit old-fashioned, which is a dreadful thing to admit in this day and age." She, of course, fundamentally disagrees, right? She thinks it's more feminine to have long hair. She's writing this essay defending her decision to have long hair. She says all the fairy princesses had it. She acknowledges that it's conservative and old-fashioned, and therefore kind of uncool in the era, but nevertheless she has it. So one thing this shows is we can't just say because one person has a certain view that the whole society does, but perhaps we can kind of define camps, right? That there are kind of different schools of thought on bobbed hair and whether it's appropriate to have your hair short or whether women should have their hair long. And another thing I want you to notice, they fundamentally agree on some things, right? Like, she says that long hair is part of an era of feminine helplessness, and now in this modern age, it's part of freedom and frankness and progressiveness. She is saying that it's traditionally feminine to have long hair, and it goes back to the fairy princesses. They are both fundamentally agreeing on the symbolism of long hair, right? That it's something that was part of an older age with different attitudes about women. I mean, even this statement about Rapunzel, think about how that ties to that statement about feminine helplessness, right? Right? What's the better example of feminine helplessness than Rapunzel waiting in the tower to be rescued, right? They just have very different, like, kind of valences on whether that's good, right? Over here, this is kind of pure and more traditionally feminine. Over here, that's kind of backward. But nevertheless, we're getting a shared understanding of the significance of short versus long hair. And I guess this is the point I'm trying to make with this. Popular culture, whether it's prevailing fashion trends or cinematic trends or music or whatever, is useful for what I'll call mapping the ideological terrain of a time period. And I use my terrain map that I was proud of. Because it doesn't tell you what everyone believes, but it can be used to illuminate some shared beliefs, right? Some common understandings. There's nothing inherent about what short hair in a woman means, but it definitely meant something in the 1920s. And you can get those shared beliefs. And you can also lay out the contours of social conflicts, right? We're clearly seeing a debate about women's behavior playing out in the arena of popular culture. And you could do the same thing with politics. You could talk about, here's a left-wing perspective and here's a right-wing perspective. Here's something criticizing communism, and here's the way people would criticize McCarthyism. Right? We can map out some of those social conflicts and see some of the ways people argued with each other, which is a rich way to study society. Okay. All right. With the theory perhaps mercifully behind us, I want to move on to practice. But I think getting that sense of how we might look at popular culture is useful. Here's my curriculum. As a reminder, if you want the PowerPoint, I'm not going to give you enough time to write all this down. So, like, it's all here. You go here. You can download the PowerPoint. You can download a handout with all this stuff. These are the 10 units in my class. And the units are all built around a certain set of popular culture sources in a particular historical moment, tackling a certain theme. So, for example, for why we fight popular culture and propaganda during World War II, we look at some propaganda posters, but we really dig into Frank Capra's Why We Fight, which is a wonderful source to use in the classroom, and Casablanca, as two different statements of why we fight, of why Americans are involved in this war, why our enemies are bad, why we are good, right? Gender ideology in the 50s sitcom, right? I show an I Love Lucy episode, a Honeymooners episode, and a Father Knows Best episode, right? And that is a way of getting at some of these questions about gender roles in the 1950s. And so I would love to kind of methodically go through all of these and tell you, like, oh, when, you know, this source helps you see this and this source helps you see this. I won't belabor that point. If you download that handout, there's a little more detail in each of these, if that intrigues you and want to see more sources. I thought it might be more useful in this setting to talk about the structure of each of these units. The way I set it up is every unit starts with a discussion of historical context. So I'm not going to just throw them into the world of these popular culture sources without, you know, telling them anything about the time period. So, for example, at the beginning of the 50s unit, I give them a reading which goes over kind of standard 50s fare in a survey course, suburbanization, economic trends, not so much Cold War here because that's not the theme of this unit, consumer culture, and gender. And I actually give them a separate reading, which is a reading that makes the argument that there's a traditional way for thinking about gender in the 50s, and then it tweaks it. The traditional way would be, women worked during World War II, then the men came home, and that fleeting revolution went away, women went back to their domestic role, men went into the workforce, and therefore the 50s was a time of gender role retrenchment. The article says there's some merit in that, however, it tweaks it a bit, and that gives us a way of saying, is this traditional narrative correct? So I have them read that, and it's like 10 pages of reading. And then in class, we review some of that, of some of the key points from those readings, but I also give them kind of new stuff to chew on that allows them to apply what they read. So we listen to Little Boxes by Malvina Reynolds, if you know that song, right? And we talk about suburbanization and the kind of critiques of suburbanization people had. I show them this ad, which is, by the way, for the dishwasher, which is good for like the age of new innovations as well as some of the gender role stuff. And so that way, class is not a lecture, though I explain some things, but it's a way of applying what they learned in the readings. Additionally, we read a page of feminine mystique, right? And so we can get Betty Friedan's arguments and also some of Betty Friedan's rhetoric, which I think is important for understanding what she's saying about what's going on in 50s popular culture. Once we spend a couple days doing that, then we move on to primary source analysis. We watch the movies. We watch the TV shows. We listen to the music, whatever the case may be. What I want to do is just talk about some of the strategies I use while doing it. While viewing the text, and I always call these things texts, one thing I do is always provide them with a graphic organizer. This is a very crude one for Rocky. I'll blow it up a little, right? The main thing I want them to do is actively watch. I think it's very easy for students to go into a passive mode when watching a film. I want them to constantly be engaging with the text and trying to analyze it. And one of the things I tell them is what they should be writing down. So snippets of dialogue that are illustrative of the trait of a character, crucial plot points in the film that help define a given character or a given environment, adjectives to describe the mannerisms of a character. Those things are worth writing down, both because they help them be active viewers, but also because in discussion afterwards, I want them to be able to give specific evidence as we discuss, right? I don't want them to just say, when the men are at home, they screw up, and when the women are at work, they screw up. I want them to say, when Ricky is making rice, he thinks you use a pound of rice per person, right? When Fred is making a cake, he thinks you mix in the frosting with the batter, right? These concrete examples that show how inept the men are, that show how incompetent the women are when they are outside of their ordained sphere. And by having concrete examples in front of them, they are much better armed for that discussion. Another thing I do while watching the primary sources is I interrupt frequently. Again, this keeps them from just settling in. But also, I think it can be really useful. For example, one thing I often do is break in and ask them questions about, okay, what do we know about such and such a character so far? What do we know about Jefferson Smith so far in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? That can be useful because if we waited till the end of the film, there'd be some stuff that, would be from the beginning of the film that they'd lose. I want to make sure to get that stuff on the table and on the board. Additionally, sometimes it's really important to kind of have a time capsule moment of what a character is like if that character is going to change. Because you can kind of set up, all right, here's how Tom Joad has been established. He doesn't think he needs to get involved with someone else's problems. And therefore, when Tom Joad gives his big speech at the end about being part of one big soul, you can kind of get the transformation that character has gone through. And so I frequently interrupt. Oh, one thing I also do with movies, I make abridged versions of them. I cut 2 hours down to an hour. And as a cinephile, that breaks my heart. On the other hand, it would eat up your class if you didn't. TV shows are awesome because they're 25 minutes. I can do those without much cutting, but films, I have to do some sort of abridged version. After viewing a text, one of the first things I do is I often give them a question to discuss in small groups. This is because, if immediately after the film ends, I ask them immediately to process right there in front of me, that can be hard. And therefore, I often give them some sort of question that they'll discuss in small groups, like, where did the humor come from in this episode? right? And so they can hash that out a bit. Or, what are the traits of Jefferson Smith? That way, in those small groups, they've already done some of that processing. The quieter kids have already gotten a little bit more of a chance to speak their minds. And then by the time we go to the big group discussion, they're armed a little better for that. Another thing I do early in the post-text discussion is map out the characters. So, there are key characters in a film, and you want to know about Lucy and you want to know about Ricky. All right, let's get the traits of Lucy on the board. Let's get the traits of Ricky on the board, right? And that's useful because, one, it's kind of lower-hanging fruit in terms of the analytical rigor that you're asking for, and so lots of people can participate. Additionally, it becomes really useful as your discussion moves on because as you start to get into the more intellectually hefty questions, you have like a map of what distinguishes some of the major characters in the film. This is where the really tough stuff and fun stuff starts, is trying to elicit the ideological implications of a text, right? Now that we've talked about Lucy and Ethel and Ricky and Fred, what is the message being sent about proper gender behavior? Let me see. And, now that we've seen The Twilight Zone, what is Serling trying to say about communism? How could this be viewed as a critique of McCarthyism? Right? Trying to get those questions, and those, by the way, were starting to get heavier. And so once again, on certain questions, I might split back into small groups or give them time to write because, it's hard to articulate this off the top of your head. But that is, certainly that is ultimately what we're trying to move towards. So, for each text in a given unit, for each TV show, I'll try to do stuff like this. Then, at the end of the unit, for the last day or more, I do some kind of synthesis discussion, right? At this point, we've watched I Love Lucy, and we've watched The Honeymooners, and we've watched Father Knows Best. And then we can start to bring things together. For example, we can do cross-textual comparison. For example, how is Lucy different from Alice Cramden? Right? I don't know if people know The Honeymooners, but it's kind of fun to compare the different female figures in these because they're not quite the same. Alice, if you've watched Honeymooners, is a lot smarter than Ralph and usually beats him in any verbal sparring that they have. So we can ask questions that compare them. Or I use Grapes of Wrath alongside Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right? So putting those two protagonists next to each other, they're both these like salt of the earth, folksy people, and yet there's also some crucial differences between these two characters. And so when we flesh these out, we can kind of really note what's distinct about them. Once again, the rubber eventually hits the road in terms of the intellectual heavy lifting. Because ultimately what we want to do is connect this to the historical context, right? Do these depictions of men and women support Betty Friedan's argument about the feminine mystique? Is this evidence that 50s popular culture was telling women to get back in the home? I think there's a legitimate debate you could have about whether that's what's going on. Put together, what messages were Americans being sent about the evils of communism in 1950s culture? How is that balanced with some fears about the excesses of McCarthyism, right? You can try to take these texts and try to, again, sketch that ideological terrain, right? See what are these associations that people have with certain genders or certain races or certain political ideologies, and try to pull that out. Finally, I also like to, in a lot of units, connect to the present day. This is, obviously, the kids can like doing this and like seeing those connections. So, for example, in the communism unit, a really good one is how does the discourse about communism compare to the modern-day discourse about terrorism? Because in some ways it's very similar, in some ways it's very different. And I think getting them to tease apart some of those similarities and differences can make for a really lucrative discussion. What was another example? Oh, in the 50s gender unit, if you ask, what do you think about how gender is depicted on television today? That conversation, I can just leave the room and let that go for a while. That one's not that hard to spearhead. So, ultimately, we can kind of set them up to connect to the present. The final aspect of the unit is I close with assessment, and the typical thing I do is fairly traditional, and I've thought about different ways of doing this, but I have them do written analysis. And one of the reasons I do is I really want to see them lay out some of these arguments, right? And so, for example, in these assessments, I'm trying to force them to do certain things. I write an irritatingly vague prompt, and I try to make them carve out an argument about the historical significance of these sources. So one thing I really want them to do is marshal textual evidence. That is, not just say, the film makes big business look bad, right? Have them articulate it. Have them describe how Keene Ranch is depicted as a place that oppresses the workers, and it has a company store, and the cops are keeping all the workers in line, and this portrays big business as this kind of oppressive threat to the working man. Right? I want them to be able to cite specific things in order to support those larger claims. The other thing I want them to be able to do is synthesize across multiple sources. The prompts always make them do that. I want them to be able to depict Grapes of Wrath, to distinguish the populism of Grapes of Wrath from the populism of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Right? I want them to note the similarities and the subtle distinctions between the sources. And so I'm trying to force them to do that. And then finally, or kind of in the act of doing these things, the prompt asks them in some way to make an argument about that connection between the text and historical context. Right? Make that link between the movie about pod people and the broader fears in American society about infiltration. Right? And so writing these prompts is something I tweak every year. I try to write them in a way that kind of doesn't give them too much and doesn't give them too little, to make them do the work but not make them read my mind. I struggle with it, but ultimately I think it can produce a level of analytical sophistication that could be really good. And ultimately, if they've taken good notes during discussion, I think they're armed to do pretty well in these papers. Here's what I'll say. Each semester culminates with a research project. So we spent all year with me setting up these units where I lay out, here are these sources that help us get at 60s political culture, or that help us understand, the discourse around the inner city in the late 80s or whatever, right? Then I say, all right, you pick popular culture sources, and you do this for a period in history. They get to decide what sources they use. They get to decide what connections they make. Obviously, I have to work with them for a couple of reasons. One, there are some pop culture geeks who are on it, and then there are some who are not, who don't know much pop culture in their own time, let alone in the 1960s, right? So I help them out and give them lists and things like that. I also work with them in finding secondary sources, because you can imagine the literature that's on these connections between film and culture are pretty dense stuff, and I try to help them navigate that. Ultimately, though, especially when they find a topic they fall in love with, they can have a lot of fun. And some students have struggled with the research, and some students have totally thrived. And so I was thinking of stuff people have done. I've had a couple students do some really good stuff on the depiction of Disney heroines and tracking them over time. Basically, they put them in light of second wave and third wave feminism, and basically talk about the Snow White damsel in distress. The Sleeping Beauty damsel in distress versus someone like Belle, who really is a funny girl, who somehow doesn't fit and doesn't go for the ultimate patriarchal masculinity of Gaston, to someone like Mulan, right? And you can track how there are changes in consumer taste over time and how Disney is pitching its princesses, right? There is such a rich topic, race in basketball. It's so good. There's this so much about racial types in basketball and what they can signify. Someone wrote a good paper about the Fab Five in the early 90s, which is really good for thinking about style and some of the associations we have with black versus white basketball players. And probably my favorite is a kid who's a comic book geek who did something with X-Men. And I'm not a comic book geek, but I realize it is rich. And so what he argued was that you have X-Men, and there's Professor X, and then there's Magneto. And they're both mutants, but importantly, one of them wants to kind of reconcile with humanity, and one of them wants to destroy humanity. And the argument he makes is what starts as kind of an ordinary hero-villain relationship ultimately becomes an allegory for Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the way that they take it. And he made a pretty compelling case. Like, I was persuaded that he wasn't just reaching for that. I think he's definitely onto something. And so, what I'm hoping students do is come to realize that they can see how a popular culture source can be related to and can act as commentary upon the society of the time. Okay. Now, so far I've gone through a lot of these and given a bunch of examples and was throwing these examples about movies you haven't seen just to kind of illustrate them. Let's dig at least a little deeper into one particular text, and that's All in the Family. Has anyone seen All in the Family? I mean, obviously, of the right generation, I think everyone in America probably watched it, and that's why this is a pretty useful source. I mean, this isn't just some random TV show. It was the #1 show for like 4 straight years in the 1970s. And in terms of cultural relevance, not every #1 show is super rich for a class like mine. All in the Family is, right? All in the Family is very consciously making social and political commentary. And as such, it is wonderful to use in a classroom. So I'm going to show a clip. As many of you know, I'll just give the short version. It is, the main character is Archie Bunker. He is, kind of a working middle-class guy, works a union job. His daughter, Gloria, and his son-in-law, Mike, are kind of new left, hippie-ish type people. And as such, the comedic antagonism of the show is those people going at each other, right? That's what the show is built around. And you'll get a taste of that in the clip I'm about to show. It's like 3 minutes. It's actually from the pilot. There are multiple pilots, but the one that landed, which was in 1971. And in this clip, I'll warn you, there is Archie using a racial slur. And I warn the kids, and I think one thing to understand is, A, wow, there's a racial slur on TV. That's pretty crazy. And 2, think about what is being said about the character and the way they depict Archie, and I think that's part of that. And so the question I'll ask you, and so think about it as you watch, in the clip we're seeing, how is Archie Bunker being depicted? Right? What are some defining characteristics? So, oh shoot, I got ahead of myself. Let me say one more thing before I show the clip, sorry. Is before I show All in the Family, I give them historical background on some of the political trends of the era and what I frame under the broad framework of the backlash against 60s liberalism. So, I talk about the backlash against black activism and race-conscious legislation like busing and affirmative action. I talk about some of the pushback against feminism and the so-called sexual revolution. And I talk about some of the criticism of the welfare state. And basically, I start the unit by saying, all right, we have Reagan being elected in 1980. How do we get there? And so like many historians these days, this is a way we're trying to track the rise of the new right. And so this unit is like kind of laying out the tectonic plates in American political culture shifting. And as a way of looking at that, Archie is a great character. So with that, we will watch the clip.
Nowadays, will you tell me girls with skirts up to here, guys with hair down to there? I stopped in a gents' room the other day, so help me, there was a guy in there with a ponytail. My heart nearly turned over in me. I thought I was in the wrong toilet.
Why do you fight it? The world's changing.
That's right. That's what the Reverend Felcher was saying. You two should have heard him. Of course, Mr. Religion here wasn't seeing eye to eye with the sermon.
What sermon? That was socialist propaganda, pure and simple. Don't give me that look. You didn't think it was so hot neither.
I said it was different, that's all, but I didn't curse the Reverend from right there in the front.
He never heard me. Besides, I ain't sitting still for no preacher telling me that I'm to blame for all this breakdown in law and order that's going on.
Why not? We're all to blame for not paying attention to the cause of it.
The cause of it? I'll tell you the cause of it. The cause of it is these sob sisters like the Reverend Felcher and the bleeding hearts and weeping Nellies like used to.
Like us?
Yeah.
I think we better eat now.
No, wait a second. Wait a second, it's you.
Me?
Yeah, that's right, you, the property owner, with your 24-inch TVs and your 4-slice toasters and your ice-making refrigerators. That's all you care about, Archie, is what you got and how you can keep it.
Oh, well, you'd care about it too, sonny boy, if you had anything. You wasn't living off of me without a pot to peel a potato in.
Wait a second. You're the one who said I could stay here while I was in school.
I thought it was going to be for a year while you learned a trade or something. I didn't think you was going to wind up in college learning how to be a subversive.
That's ridiculous. I just want to learn a little bit about society so I can help people.
People? Your mother-in-law and me as people. Help us, will you? Go to work.
I know what's bothering you. You're upset because I was nailing you on that Law and Order thing.
You nailing me?
Yeah, that's right. Now I'm going to tell you something.
Oh, Michael.
No, wait a second. I'm sorry, Gloria. I know I promised, but I feel I got to say. You know why we got to break down in Law and Order in this country, Archie? Because we got poverty, real poverty. And you know why we got that? Because guys like you are unwilling to give the black man, the Mexican American, and all the other minorities their just and rightful hard-earned share of the American dream.
Who said he wasn't smart? That's beautiful, Michael, beautiful.
Oh, that's gorgeous. Now, let me tell you something. If your spicks and your spades want their rightful share of the American dream, let them get out there and hustle for it just like I did.
Yeah, but Archie, you're forgetting one thing. You didn't have to hustle with a black skin.
No, I didn't have to hustle with one arm and one leg neither. So what?
So you're admitting that the black man is handicapped.
Oh, no more than me. He's just as good as me.
Wait, now I suppose you're going to tell me that the black man has had the same opportunity in this country as you?
More. He's had more. I didn't have no million people out there marching and protesting to get me my job.
No, his uncle got it for him.
All I'm saying is don't blame me. You and that Reverend Bleeding Heart Felcher up there in his ivory shower.
All right. So, I will, and once again, if you could use your mics when you talk, what are some things that we see in this clip about Archie and his beliefs and attitudes? What are some of the things we could point to that kind of say, all right, here's what Archie believes. Here are his political views. Yeah, thank you.
He's against affirmative action.
Good. Right? And why do you say that?
No one helped me get my job.
Good. No one helped me get my job, right? I didn't have 1 million people marching in the streets for me. And by the way, you notice Edith, who often kind of without realizing it totally undermines Archie's arguments, says, yeah, his uncle got it for him. Right, pointing out, I think the implication here is that he had connections that perhaps the African Americans might not have had, that might explain the marching in the streets. Right? What are some other things? What else does he not like?
He's definitely a bigot.
Oh my God! It was because it was through the microphone. I was like, yeah. I was like, where is that the voice of God?
They still show this program like on TV today.
Yeah, right.
You can scroll through and find it.
Yeah, I mean,
usually during the evening.
Yep, absolutely, right. And you said he's a bigot, right? We get that the way he uses racial slurs about Latinos and African Americans. You can get it if you watch more and more of the show. The running gag with Archie is he has a stereotype about every person, and he assumes everyone he meets from that group will fit that stereotype, right? He assumes, and I'll say the stereotypes, he assumes that black people will be lazy. He assumes that the Jews will be swindlers. Like the doctor, he says he's always trying to get more money out of me because he's a member of that tribe, right? He does all these things, and I guess we're supposed to laugh at that. I mean, the crowd certainly does. It certainly made some people feel uncomfortable.
He's always proved wrong.
Yeah, good. And
He's always proved wrong.
And this is, I mean, Edith undermining him is crucial. He often is whether he realizes it or not, is shown to be ignorant in the way that he is expressing these ideas. What does he think of Mike? What are some of the things he's yelling at Mike about? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, he talks about being brainwashed at the university or becoming a subversive.
Yeah, right? And so the way I tried to summarize this here is like his attitude about college education and what's happening there is decidedly negative. And you're right. He said brainwashed, they're teaching you to be a subversive. Yeah.
It's almost like he sees Mike as part of the welfare state that he's clearly against because he's taking care of Mike.
Good. I mean, he
his welfare.
always ribs Mike about not having a job. Right? He says, you're living under my roof. And there's a good line. He actually wins in verbal combat, I would say, in that one line where he's like, you want to help people, your mother and me as people, go to work, right? And so that's definitely a great point. If I can make one more thing about college education, notice that he says, I thought you'd be going to school for a year to learn a trade. Right? You know, his idea of what education is not studying sociology, which is what we learned in other episodes, what Mike studies, right? Which he views with utter disdain, right? And shoot, there's something else. Oh, at the end, did you catch this? It's the very last thing, and it kind of cuts off. The Reverend Felcher, he talks about him in his ivory shower, right? He means ivory tower, right? But again, there's that kind of resistance, dislike, and so forth. Let me get back to the welfare state thing. Let me make one more point. In general, the so-called new politics of the 60s is something he disdains. If you caught at the very beginning, it's guys with hair down to here, girls with hair up to here. There was a guy, so help me, in the bathroom, he was wearing a ponytail, right? And when it gets into this debate about law and order, think about Mike's response. Mike is a very new left answer. It's about poverty, it's about racism, and so forth. And he says, no, it's about the bleeding hearts like Reverend Felcher and the weeping Nellies like you. That is the breakdown of law and order. I think this is the age of Nixon running on a law and order campaign. It's about the protesters, right? And so we're seeing that generational divide in the argument between Archie and particularly his son, though Gloria is involved with it as well. I want to get to one final thing, and I will play the theme song to All in the Family, which some of you might know, and you can listen to the dulcet tones of Edith Bunker. So I have the lyrics here. You can listen to it, and I just want you to think about what this is, what the sort of political stance being expressed here is.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played
Songs that made the hit parade.
guys like us, we had it made. Those were the days.
And you knew when you were there.
Dance for girls and men were men. Mister, we could use a man like Herbert Hoover again. Didn't need no welfare state.
Everybody pulls his weight.
G.R.O. LaSalle and great. Those were the days.
Just because we're getting to the top of the hour and I want to leave some time for questions, I'll railroad you a bit on this. And let me just point out a couple of things. One, we see this sort of nostalgia. And, I mean, people talk about Archie Bunker as a reactionary character. He certainly is pointing to ways in which society has changed for the worse, right? And we see that in the, back in the day, Glenn Miller was playing the songs in the hit parade, and the old Buick LaSalle ran great. We have that stuff. But then we see stuff that's more explicitly political, right? We see didn't need no welfare state. Right? This is post-Great Society, right? People were pulling their weight back then, right? And then we have, you knew who you were then, girls were girls and men were men, right? The gender roles were stable. And so, what's being expressed in this Those Were the Days theme song is this kind of longing for a time of yesterday before things got out of whack. And that fits very well with a certain political sentiment being expressed at the time. Now, what I asked the students is, all right, we have these different characters who express different things. What do you think Norman Lear thinks? Norman Lear is the creator and producer and main creative mind behind the show. And I strategically don't tell them before, but they figure out what you were mentioning, which is that basically Archie is often shown to be wrong or ignorant. Norman Lear is a liberal, right? This is not a show that ultimately tries to defend Archie. In fact, he's the butt of many jokes, though somewhat sympathetically portrayed at times. Yes, the new left characters get ribbed sometimes. There is something I show them where Mike is being, basically we're supposed to laugh at Mike for using his intellectual jargon. We're supposed to roll our eyes. Nevertheless, most of the opprobrium is directed at Archie, right? He says ivory shower instead of ivory tower. Right? He's always prone to that kind of malapropism. He talks about morphodites instead of hermaphrodites. And no one ever gets this, and maybe someone in this room will, instead of B'nai B'rith, he says B'nai Bris. So Jewish humor. He's always misstating things. He's often shown to be wrong or ignorant. And as such, this is a way of skewering this reactionary conservatism of the time. It is a decidedly liberal show. And yet, I also have them read an article from Life in 1971. The article is about the All in the Family phenomenon. It blew up. It became an enormously popular show right away. And it's about a town in Oregon in which people really like the show. And what it's about is that people really like Archie. There are people who sympathize and identify with his character. For example, one of them in the story says, I wish there were more Archie bunkers. You can't change their way, that's all. Like me, they're asking me to go along with all these new ways today, but I can't see it. Me and Archie, it's too late for us. Right? Someone viewing his kind of disdain and befuddlement at some of the changes in American society and say, yeah, I feel the same way. And then there's another line where it says, a guy says, you think it, but old Archie, he says it by damn. Right? Right? Maybe it's something I think but don't want to say, but here's Archie saying it on television, right? Saying what we just scrawl on bathroom walls, right? And this was attractive to a number of people. And what I'll say about this is this wasn't the intention. And perhaps these people were missing the satire of it, but maybe they were well aware of the satire of it. They just chose to ignore it. Yes, you're trying to make fun of this character, but actually, I think he's funny and has a lot of good points. And I think what this gets to is the point I was trying to make about how we need to look at a popular culture text. Right? We can't just say, this is made in 1971, therefore this is what people believed in 1971. No, we need to pick apart the ideological content of the show and try to see what's Archie's philosophy, what's Mike's philosophy. We need to consider what the agenda of the producer is, what Norman Lear is trying to do with this show. But we also have to entertain the notion that consumers aren't necessarily passive receptacles for whatever is being pushed their way. Some people could look at that same show and draw a very different conclusion. And this, in terms of what I'm trying to get at, is a way that we can get at some of these shared beliefs and social conflicts of a given time. If you want to kind of see some of the discourse surrounding the changes in American society, the political debates about things like affirmative action and anti-war agitation and the counterculture, right? This is a venue in which you could see it explored in front of society, right? And so, if we're trying to sketch these ideological contours of American society, a text like All in the Family is a good way of doing it. The final thing I'll say is that I started doing this 4 years ago, and then 2015, we have the Trump campaign, and then that connecting to today's discussion got really interesting because the connections between some of the politics of Archie, and if we look at some of those were the days, and some of the attitudes of Archie, we can make a lot of connections. All right, so just what I hope you take out of this, obviously none of you, I don't think any of you would want to do my whole curriculum wholesale. Most of you wouldn't have if you're teaching AP US history, you just can't. But I hope there's things you can take out of it. Certainly thinking about how you could use the text from the time period and analyze it and have students work with it to draw conclusions. And maybe some of the specific things like Twilight Zone, awesome to use in class. That I Love Lucy episode I referred to, it's called Job Switching, awesome to use in class. All in the Family, if you can handle some of the vulgarity at your school, great to use in class. And so there's some concrete sources. But I guess the final thing I'll say, and I won't show the student comments, but basically the kids actually have to engage in pretty serious intellectual work in this class. Right? In order to do the kind of analysis that I'm trying to help them do, they can't just be passive receptacles and just sit back and enjoy the film. And it, I think, is a fun way and engaging way for them to debate and discuss. And then ultimately, I think they are really grappling with some of the more sophisticated things that historians have to do, thinking about subjectivity of your sources, thinking about how we can relate our text to the historical context. And as such, I think it is a really rich thing to do as opposed to just a lazy thing to do when you don't feel like prepping on a given day, right? So anyway, sorry, I only left you a couple minutes, but thank you. I'm curious, do people have any questions or do people have any sources that they've used in class that they think would be good? Yeah, go for it. Oh, could you use the microphone? Yeah.
Is this a year-long class?
Yeah, so this is a year-long class. In spoiler or asterisk, I actually cut it down to a semester to make room for a new class I wanted to teach. And so my curriculum's a little different now. I had to cut some stuff. But yes, as I described it, and I wrote like an article about this somewhere, as I described it there, like it's a year-long class. Yeah.
What advice do you have you gave a lot of really great specific advice for using video, like movies and TV shows. What advice do you have for using music? Yeah,
so it's a really great question. Like, what do you do for music? And one answer to that question is I'm not as good at using music, right? I just, when I've done it, I know I am much better at at knowing how to analyze film than music, and so I struggle with it. However, I think a couple of important things to lay out there. I do stuff with rock and roll, and I think one of the things to try to get them attuned to, and not just the music people, is differences in performative style, like how someone sings, and also differences in instrumentation. And so try to like get them to think about that as they're watching or listening. Yes, I think one temptation to avoid is focusing too much on lyrics, because while lyrics can be really interesting, and certainly for someone like me who's used to reading normal text, that's great. But if you want to understand the influence of a certain genre of music, the lyrics aren't always that important. I mean, if you think about it, you don't even notice the lyrics half the time when you're listening to a song. And so particularly in rock and roll, I try to get them to focus on instrumentation and performative style, and then link those things to race in that particular unit, is try to think about how we can see different musical traditions coming out of different aspects of American culture and see how they weave together. For rap, then you can focus on the lyrics, and there's a lot of good stuff there. I also have done stuff with jazz that I don't do anymore for time reasons. But I think one of the things, just to try to summarize, is there will be some students who get music because they play it and will immediately pick up on it. For other students, you kind of have to walk them through what to listen for in order to interpret it. Hope that helps. Yeah.
Do you ever show any episodes of Archie Bunker's Place?
No.
Where
I admit, I haven't seen Archie Bunker's Place.
Purposeful evolution of his character, because his world crashes down on him when he loses his job, and he takes his union pension and buys some dive bar in his neighborhood. But all the other characters left.
Yeah.
Gene Stapleton left the show. Rob Reiner left the show. Sally Struthers left the show, and it was just him. And the show becomes more about class, and he starts to understand a little bit better that the things that he thought he once controlled in his life are really out of his control, and all the characters in the bar sort of play that up. Now it's supposed to be funny, but Norman Lear said this is sort of supposed to be Archie Bunker evolving to his time, particularly in the economy of New York City.
It's the late 70s by then. Yeah, that's awesome. That's really good stuff. I'd only vaguely read about it, but the argument you're making is really good, because it would fit well with the trends we see in the 1970s, right? And certainly one of the things, when I do stuff in the late 70s, I have used Saturday Night Fever and Rocky, both of which are set in that economically depressed, blue-collar, ethnic, urban setting, and that fits really nicely with that, and there's a really nice conversation piece with the early show.
You ever compare Mickey to Archie Bunker?
So for Rocky,
Mickey's traditionalism works.
Yeah.
I mean, they go back to 1930s style of training a boxer. Right?
Yes. And he's able to climb up based on that.
He rails against everything that's going around him, but inside of his boxing gym, the 1930s work.
Yeah, I actually hadn't thought about Mickey in that vein. That's pretty cool. So I definitely want to let people go because it's past 10, so you can go and enjoy your break. However, I'm here, and in case you haven't noticed, I would love talking more about pop culture and history. So if you want to come up and talk, I'd love it. Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah.
I'll mention one source